So a couple of things. Is there anyone who has not been to a community conversations before? Oh, okay. Well, then let's go over the basic rules. And nor has Sadie, so no banking. So community conversations, we started as a community project to really talk about end-of-life discussions in our community to help raise awareness and to change the culture around death and dying. And we've been doing it for a little bit over a year. It's really exciting to see people that keep coming and new faces. That's also really a really wonderful thing, so thank you for coming. The way that it will go is Amy will present, she's our guest speaker today, and then for about 15 to 30 minutes, and then we will have a chance to have an open discussion about whatever topic Amy will surprise us with, which I'll tell you in a minute. But there are a few laundry items that I just want to let you know. Through the archway to the right are bathrooms, so if you need to use a restroom, that's where you would find it. There is scratch paper and pens and paper up on the table here, so if you'd like to take notes or something provokes a thought, feel free to grab those and take notes. Those are for you. And in a group participation, I think that there are a couple things that we just like to keep at the top of our minds. Make sure that we practice active listening, so be sure that we're listening to what everyone else is saying and not just thinking about the next thing that we'll be saying. And then when you do talk, let's make sure that we keep it sort of brief. Lawrence isn't here, so we don't have to worry about it as much as usual, but he would say that he can be a long talker, even though he always has wonderful things to say. So I'm Marika, I'm with Hospice of Missoula, and actually this is my last month with Hospice of Missoula, so I've turned in my resignation and I'm leaving as of January.
Oh my gosh.
So this is a new thing for me, but I'm really excited about it. I've started my own company locally, and I will still be participating in this. It's something that is really tried and true for us, and it's something that I feel really strongly about, so I'm happy to continue. Mindy really will be carrying the torch for community conversations, and I feel so good leaving it in her capable hands, so thank you so much for doing that. It's a really wonderful thing.
You'll just have to come every month.
I'm happy to come. This is so much fun for me. One of the things about community conversations that I find to be so rewarding is it really, I don't know about everyone else that works in hospice, but it really makes me love my job so much more. It's nice to see people coming that are actively engaged and have questions and really want to learn more about this process. And then they can take that out into the community and share it, and that's another huge benefit. So tonight, Amy has presented a couple of times, so we get to see you again, which I love, so thank you so much for being here. Today, Amy is here as the Montana campaign organizer for Compassion and Choices, and she's been doing this work for 2 years?
It'll be 3 in March.
Wow, 3 years. That's awesome. High five on that. Thank you. She works very closely with Dr. Eric Kress, who has spoken here as well, so knows him well and has helped him to do different talks around the country, around the state and the country. And today her focus will be on the history of the movement of physician aid in dying in Montana and sort of where we are right now, so that we have an idea of where we are, and if we wanted to be politically active, what would that look like, and what would we be talking about to our different politicians, I'm guessing. Yep. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marika, for the opportunity again. I'm delighted to see more men here. I've been coming to the community conversations, and a lot of times it's more heavily attended by females, so I'm glad to see more
Maybe that's
men.
why the men are here.
Because I'm speaking?
What do you think about that, Amy? Continue.
I first want to say I love Hospice of Missoula. I started coming to these to network and to learn more about what people are thinking about and talking about in terms of death and dying and hospice. And I also was coming because my mom was dying. My mom was ill, and that was the last time I talked several months ago, was telling my personal story as a regular person and using hospice and going through the bedside dying process with my mother. I really do appreciate the opportunity tonight. I want to keep my comments probably closer to the 15-minute zone, maybe 20, and then really get a conversation going, because I think that people can talk and you can pay attention for a while, but let's engage. Feel free to ask questions at any time. If I say something that you didn't quite hear or that you don't quite understand, please feel free to ask a question. The history of the movement in Montana started probably around 2004 or 5, I'm going to say. Bob Baxter, and I'm just going to read right from this, was a Marine veteran, outdoorsman, and career long-haul truck driver. He petitioned the state of Montana for the right to get medication to end his suffering should it become unbearable. We helped represent him with Mark Connell, who is a local lawyer who did a ton of work for nothing, and our legal team from DC petitioned the state for Bob Baxter to seek relief from his dying process should it become unbearable. And I'll just draw your attention to the last paragraph. In a detailed review of Montana law on the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act, the court concluded that the legislature specifically defers to a patient's own decisions and affords the patient the right to control their bodies at the end of life. I think in a sentence, that's the bottom line of what we stand behind Compassion and Choices is your right to be in charge of your body and all phases of life, but most importantly, at the end. The decision to self-administer life-ending medication receives the same treatment as the decision to discontinue life-sustaining therapies such as mechanical ventilation. In my personal opinion, if you seek the prescription from your doctor, if you turn off your pacemaker, if you stop dialysis, if you refuse an operation, if you don't want to be on a ventilator, I feel that those are all the same. It's you choosing what to do with your body and the condition that you have and the treatment that you want. And in this case, the condition is you're dying. And the treatment is making that happen on your own terms with the medication. Eric Kress was our hero in the last legislative session because he testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House Committee, for that matter, that if this became illegal, he would be in the population of doctors that would be arrested. And he said, I have written the prescription 3 times, he said at that time, out of 10 people asking for it. So one of the things that I will underscore with that is that it's not you got a strep throat, you need penicillin. It's not like that. Dying is a process. Getting the prescription is a process, not an event. It's numerous conversations. It's not a quick decision for the patient or the family or the physician, for that matter. So 2009, 5-2, the Supreme Court, the Montana Supreme Court voted in favor of Bob Baxter. So we refer to the Baxter decision or the Baxter ruling as our core law because it's a law through the Supreme Court decision. It's not a law by voter referendum. It's not a law by legislative means. It's a law by a Supreme Court decision. And we've been protecting that ever since it was decided, December 31st, 2009. 5 years ago, we now have a 5-year report that will be published in a few weeks, looking at, okay, what's happened since this Baxter decision? How many people have tried to get this? Well, we don't really know that because we're not the same as Oregon. Oregon and Washington both have voter referendum passed laws that allow for aid in dying or physician aid in dying, death with dignity, all the same thing. We don't have the same amount of data because we're not required to keep, the state of Montana is not required to keep those records. And that's a big difference. In my opinion, it's great that we have almost 17 years of history of Oregon's process because they do keep track of who gets it, what's their disease, when they took it, how long did it take for them to stop functioning. All of that data I can provide up to 2012. There's no reported cases of elder abuse or of families doing something else with the medicine, or something happens to the medicine because a third of the patients that got the prescription didn't use it. And I, again, from having gone through my mom's dying process, when she died, the medicine was gathered up and taken care of. There's no opportunity for the medicine to get in the wrong hands if the process that's gone through is meeting the guidelines, which we follow in Montana. The doctors that I've talked to follow the guidelines of Oregon, that the person must be mentally competent, they must be 18, they must be dying, terminally ill, and they must be able to self-administer. So one of the things that we were going to talk about tonight is dispelling myths. And aid in dying or death with dignity is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is putting your pet out of its misery, or someone else, deciding for someone else. Death with dignity is a very personal and individual decision and process. So my mom, for example, she had dementia. She wouldn't have qualified. She would have probably sought aid in dying if she were mentally competent and had a different disease than she had at the end of her life. But there was no opportunity and there was no discussion whatsoever about my brothers and my dad and I going, well, let's get mom the medication because, you know, she doesn't want to live like this. Her death was fairly quick. The staircase of health, she just really fell off it in the last 10 days of her life. Someone facing a long-term, debilitating, painful disease process wants to have options. And in the continuum of care toward the end of life, we believe that this is an option that mentally competent adults of sound mind should be able to seek. Since the Baxter decision, we've been defending it. Since it very first came down, we've been defending it from people who are opposed to the whole idea of ending someone's suffering. Largely, the arguments opposing death with dignity are based in religion and personal beliefs of other people who they don't believe in it. And it's, in our opinion, in my opinion, the right to seek what you choose at end of life for your treatment. So the Baxter decision was decided. Montanans Against Assisted Suicide incorporated very soon after that. And that's, if I say the opposition, it's generally that organization that is behind a lot of the counter attacks to Baxter, didn't make it legal. And if there's a lawyer in the room, Baxter didn't make it legal in terms of the consent defense was part of the ruling. That if a doctor were asked about, you know, well, what happened with this patient at the end of their life? And they said, well, they wanted the prescription for aid in dying. The defense for the doctor, should a suit come about, would be consent, that the patient said that's what they wanted. There hasn't been any doctor arrested. There hasn't been any issue on that level at all. And even after Dr. Kress said in front of God and everybody and the Senate Judiciary Committee, I've written the prescription. He has not been arrested and he's not going to be arrested. If he was, I think it would have happened by now.
And for something else.
Pardon?
And for something else. More likely.
So, in the past 2 legislative sessions, there have been permissive bills and prohibitive bills. Both have failed both times. There is a senator who really wants to codify Baxter and make it a legislative law decided by our legislature that this is legal and acceptable as a medical practice with the guidelines comparable to Oregon's. And we're just not, the legislator just isn't voting on that. We have a lot of people who like that they can vote against both, and they want to leave it status quo. They want to leave it as the Baxter decision allows for the terminally ill to decide what to do with their bodies when they're dying. There will be a prohibitive and a permissive bill this next session. We already know that there's a placeholder bill submitted to criminalize a doctor providing this prescription or even talking about it. And it's under the header of soliciting or aiding a suicide. That's my perfect segue to talk about two different suicide stories. How many of you heard the Brittany Menard news in October and November? Brittany Menard was the 29-year-old who moved from California to Oregon specifically to get access to aid in dying because she was terminally ill. She had a brain tumor that was going to end her life. During the course of her disease, she had seizures that rendered her speechless and immobile for differing times, differing lengths of times. And when she was in that, couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything, she really became aware of the fact that she could have a seizure that would render her immobile and speechless for the rest of her life. She chose to move to Oregon and get the prescription and get aid in dying. And in that process, she thought, this just shouldn't be so hard. I have the means and the family support system to move and to move in advance, to get a whole new relationship and a whole new team of doctors on board that will help her with her decision. And she came to us. A lot of people have criticized Compassion and Choices for exploiting Brittany and using her story and taking advantage of her. She approached us. She felt so strongly that it shouldn't be so difficult and expensive to get what she wanted, that she thought all Americans should have this right and access to this treatment, this medical treatment. I have a letter from her mother that I will hand out as well. And again, I will go to the last paragraph. The culture of cure has led to a fairy tale belief that doctors can always fix our problems. And I'll interject there, well, maybe they can, but maybe you don't want fixed. Maybe there's more that can be done, but that's more suffering and more elongating the dying process. So back to Debbie's letter. We have lost sight of reality. All life ends. Death is not necessarily the enemy in all cases. Sometimes a gentle passing is a gift. Misguided doctors caught up in an aspirational belief that they must extend life, whatever the cost, cause individuals and families unnecessary suffering. Brittany stood up to bullies. She never thought anyone else had the right to tell her how long she should suffer. The right to die for the terminally ill is a human rights issue, pure and simple. And I've had doctors and lawyers and legislators tell me this will not be decided in the courts, it won't be decided in the MMA or the AMA, it'll be decided by the people, by society. Nationally, when polled, over 70% of Americans believe that this treatment ought to be available at the end of life. We have numerous data that when phrased, death with dignity or aid in dying, that's much different than assisted suicide. And if you take nothing else from this tonight, is that language. Death with dignity, physician aid in dying are not assisted suicide. And that's what this article talks about. This came out during all of the Brittany media coverage, and it's called What We Can Learn from Falling Man. Falling Man is the iconic picture from 9/11 of the man jumping out the window with his tie and suit and briefcase. It's an iconic picture from that day. And this Benjamin Corey wrote this article that he thought the matter was settled in his mind before Brittany's story. He was positively against the idea that a physician-assisted suicide should be legal, and those are his words. However, and here's another one of Brittany's accomplishments in the last weeks, I don't feel the way I did a few weeks ago. And that gives me goosebumps even now that Brittany changed this guy's mind. I don't know how many other people's minds she may have changed or affected, but this man wrote an article about what we can learn from falling man. So you're in one of the towers. You're in the tower that's burning. No, yeah, hold her, please, sorry. The image is of an unidentified man who was trapped on one of the upper levels of the Trade Center and ultimately made the decision to jump to his death instead of being burned alive or suffocating by smoke. I can't imagine making that choice. I've tried, but I can't. Burning alive, suffocating by smoke, jumping out the window. And in the rest of this article, he talks about nobody is condemning any of the jumpers, and there were over 200. Nobody is calling them suicidal. Their death certificates all say blunt force trauma to the head, and nobody is condemning them for jumping. They were going to die. Burning alive, smoke inhalation, or jumping. That's the same thing that Brittany said. How am I going to die? I am dying. Am I going to die this way with my disease taking me, or am I going to die by my own terms, on my own timeline? And that to me is a very concrete example. And we've talked about that before in terms of compassion and choices and 9/11, that this is the day you're dying, and you choose how that final act goes. Brittany didn't wake up one morning and say, I hate my life, I'm going to kill myself. Just like those who jumped on 9/11 didn't step up to the ledge and jump because they had other things that made them suicidal. They chose to die on their terms. So I will hand this out after I read a little bit more from the last page. And I mean no offense to anyone that is Christian or may have an opposing view tonight, but in all of the years since 9/11, Benjamin Corey, again, his words, I've never once heard a Christian speak up in judgment or condemnation over the 9/11 jumpers. I've never heard someone say they sinned because they hastened their death instead of accepting God's timing. I've never heard anyone say that failing to condemn their choice is a slippery slope that could send the message that suicide is okay. All I've ever heard about the 9/11 jumpers is how difficult their choice must have been and how sad it is that their lives were taken by terrorism. The ones who recognize the truth that while the 9/11 jumpers didn't commit suicide, Brittany Menard did not either. In terms of this legislative session and compassion and choices, there is, as I've already said, a bill in place to criminalize doctors if they talk about or provide aid in dying to their terminally ill patients. My work as an organizer is to find the people with the story that feel passionately enough about this to write a letter to the editor, to write an email to a senator or a House of Representatives legislator, or to, in fact, go to Helena and testify on our behalf that the Baxter decision should stay in place and that aid in dying is an acceptable legal practice for doctors to provide dying patients. So if anybody wants to get on my list, I'm happy to take your information. That's about 20 minutes in terms of laying the groundwork, what's happened in Montana, what's happening now. We are going to be fighting a bad bill, and we are going to have a difficult time of it this time. We think that the makeup of our legislature is not totally friendly to opposing this issue. As I've said, Many people would like to just vote no on both bills and just leave it lay. We actually heard from a few people just, please don't bring it up again. And we're like, we won't, but we're going to fight back if they do. And there is a bill, Representative Jerry Bennett out of Libby has put in a bill that it's redefining crimes in the assisted suicide language of our Montana Code annotated. We don't have anything specific yet in terms of what does the bill say, but it would help make this a criminal act, make a doctor liable for criminal charges if they provide aid in dying or write the prescription. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Because I really do want to have a conversation more than Amy talks and everybody listens.
From a legal case, a legislative law is stronger than the Baxter case, or what happens?
Not necessarily, and I'm not a
Or
lawyer.
is it most recent judgment that comes out? Like what? How do they decide what takes precedence? So that's a good question.
If we put it to a voter referendum statewide on a ballot and it became a law that way, I think it would provide confidence and comfort to physicians, because I've talked to plenty of doctors who's like, yeah, well, until it's really legal, I'm kind of, not sure I want to participate. I don't know that it would be any more legal. It might be in the minds, it might be in conceptually more legal, but I think that the Baxter decision is enough for doctors to write prescriptions and not be criminals.
Who is the senator that does believe in it, that's behind it?
Dick Barrett here in Missoula. And he's personally very engaged because both of his parents died long, suffering ordeals of dying. And he wished that they had had the opportunity to be in charge of their final days.
So Amy, I heard you say something about assisted suicide and death with dignity being different, and could you outline the differences between those two things? I'm not clear still on what
Yes.
those things are.
Well, the main thing is assisted suicide is a phrase that the opposition uses to incite fear and create doubt. Assisting a suicide is illegal. If I helped you load a gun or tie a rope so that you could kill yourself, that's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
You're healthy and young and having a bad day. I mean, and I don't mean
How did you know?
I don't mean to make light of suicide, because that is a real issue and that's an important issue, but it's a completely different issue. If you look at the numbers, Montana has a very high rate of suicide, but it's not people that are terminally ill, generally speaking. It's people that have mental health issues and other circumstances that are making them suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
So Brittany Menard says it really good in her story too. She had the prescription for weeks before she decided to take it. If she was suicidal, she would have taken it the day she got it. So assisted suicide is illegal, and it's a phrase, again, used to make it scary. When you're dying and you hasten the day of your death, it's not suicide. And Dr. Kress articulates that better than I just did, but the difference is wanting to live, but your body is dying, you're sick and dying. Suicide is wanting to end your life.
So death with dignity would be you must have a terminal illness,
Yes.
and assisted suicide not so much.
Well, assisted suicide is, again, it's a phrase that the opposition uses to make it fuzzy and muddy in the water, to go, well, now what are they talking about? Death with dignity is kind of the lay term. Aid in dying is a more medically oriented term.
Okay.
They're all the same in this conversation, but again, our preferred wording is don't use the S word.
I think that's what's so confusing for people is what you would call what one person calls suicide and what another one
it's just so vague for interpretation. I wish there was like concrete language agreement across the board. So we all started at the same language place and then understood background from there. I don't think that'll ever happen.
No, it's not. It's a very gray issue. There's nothing black and white about it. I think that even people who are for or opposed don't really know what they'll do if it's them that's doing the dying. I think that until you're in it, like many, many things, you don't really know what you'll do until you're in it. I have a good friend who's Catholic, and she's like, oh my gosh, Amy, I would never, ever do that. But I sure don't want to stand in your way if that's in line with your belief system and your own personal circumstances. Who am I to get in the way of you deciding that for yourself? I would never do it. But if that's right for you, then I'm not going to stand in your way of getting that. And I wish there were more people that thought that way.
Has anyone ever compared it to, when you have a pregnancy, if you would plan a C-section or if you would have a natural birth?
No, but that's a good analogy. It's like anything. If you have kidney problems, do you want medicine or surgery or a transplant or dialysis? And I'm not a doctor, so that might not be a great example, but when there's something wrong with you, you have options. If you're diagnosed with breast cancer, you get different options. And some people say, I don't want chemo and I don't want radiation. I'm going to fight it with essential oils and other alternative means. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. But the right to refuse a double mastectomy is that woman's choice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I think of that as like when you're pregnant, that it's a natural process. You know that you're eventually going to have a baby. There's no question unless something would happen. And then essentially you're giving someone permission to cut you open and take that child out on a day that you choose with your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a hard time reconciling how that's much different. If you had a terminal illness, you knew that was the progression unless something were to happen, and then you made a choice with your physician about when that were to happen. I mean, that seems really similar to me.
It is. It is.
You have to look too at the product, do no harm. When you're trying to take your baby out, you're trying for the best interests of both the mother and the child.
I agree with you. I think you're saying a really valid point, especially if it were an emergency cesarean or if something were happening. But I think that more and more people elect to have surgery, which is always a risk, because they want to plan when that pregnancy were to happen, right? So, if my family's coming and I want to make sure that they're there when that happens, I might plan it to be on the 25th because that's in my 9th week or my 9th month. And that's not necessarily an emergency, and it's not going to harm me to have the baby naturally. It was a choice that I was offered in medicine, and I think that I don't think that there is an argument that would say one way is more effective or safer than the other. But I'm not also a physician, but I haven't ever heard that, and I've had babies.
But the outcome of what they're doing by giving the medication is the death of this person.
Right, but it was already happening. Just sort of like the baby was already happening.
Not happening. I like to play devil's advocate.
No, I think that is a good point. I mean, I guess to me there's just that correlation because they're both natural life processes, and we both and then in both circumstances we've chosen another way. And I think that medicine, it will continue to advance and give us more and more options for many, many natural life processes. And maybe it's artificial and maybe it isn't the natural way. I mean, taking my appendix out when it ruptured wasn't natural. I should have died from that, but I wanted that and I got to choose that. And I think that science will continue to do those things, and I think it's wonderful. That's what's keeping us alive for such a length of time where we would consider physician-aided dying, because medicine's amazing, and I don't want to depreciate that at all. I don't feel that way.
And on that note, modern medicine allows everyone to live longer with more disease because of all of the advances. So you can have 3 or 4 chronic conditions or diseases that would have, one of any of the four would have killed you 100 years ago. But with the advances, we can keep people alive longer with more disease. And again, it's the choice of, if you're 60 and dialysis 3 times a week, you know, that's okay. 85, 90 years old, dialysis 3 times a week. If you say, Doc, I'm over it, I'm done with dialysis, I want to go off of dialysis, and your doctor says, but that will kill you, you say, I understand that, I want you to help me through that whole dying process as best as you can, but I'm done coming here 3 times a week. That's okay. You can turn off your pacemaker. You can stop taking insulin. To me, it's the same thing. And we could have a never-ending debate. And I've just seen it in the 3 years that I've been with Compassion and Choices. There's always going to be people who are opposed, and there will always be people who are for. And mutual respect that we agree to disagree is really, I mean, we're never going to have consensus.
But the bottom line is, nobody has the right to tell me what to do
Correct.
with the most sacred decision I make. It's bottom line. That for me is the heart of the whole abortion debate. Mm-hmm. Bottom line, it's the choice of the individual.
Bodily autonomy. Yes.
I mean, I guess that was my other question. You know, when you were talking about the Montanans Against Assisted Suicide, is that similar to the group of people who would oppose abortion, and is it for the same reasons? Are they the same?
Wouldn't speak for them or to that too specifically, but I would say yes. Mm-hmm. That the ongoing phrase here is that Sadie doesn't like strangers that are tall. That
everybody.
Train of thought, come back.
We're talking about people who might oppose abortion and then also maybe oppose physician aid and dying.
Is it the same population?
Are they the same group of people? And is it for the same
Relatively.
reason? I mean, it seems similar.
It is that your life belongs to God. Your body belongs to God, and His timing provides when you should die. And there are just a lot of people that don't believe in God. And there are people that have their own relationship with the divine, and they will exercise free will to choose what's appropriate for them. And again, I think that I advocate for this on a daily basis. I'm not sure if I were terminally ill that I would get it. I think I would, but I'm not sure.
But bottom line, that doesn't matter.
No.
I mean,
It
it's
should
your
be
call.
available.
It's your call.
It should be available. If I want it, I'll get it, and if I don't, I won't. And if you don't want it, then don't get it. But if
Oh, I'm sorry.
you go ahead.
Interrupting you, but you have a very provocative statement that triggered something in me, and I have no answer but more questions. Is you brought up the Hippocratic Oath, which is a doctor will do no harm. I don't even know what the verbiage is, but I know it's something like that. A doctor has to prescribe this to you. Therefore, you are, even if it's your choice, you're still at the whim of somebody living up to their idea of what their oath was or is. And you're still then at the whim of somebody deciding how they're going to apply their oath. And I think that in and of itself is also provocative, and it's not as clear as what you're saying, is that I believe, yes, I should have that right, but we still have to hold somebody's hand to get the medicine. And that person still has an oath, and they, I would assume, are the ones that decide how they're going to apply that.
But the question, if you want to unpack the oath, is, does it do more harm to keep me alive
Exactly.
at huge amount of pain and suffering and cost and emotional?
Trauma to your family, watching
the
you,
whole works, yeah.
watching you deteriorate.
But that's not the argument I'm not making an argument, but that's not necessarily the point that I'm trying to bring out, because I agree with you completely. I'm just thinking along the lines of, if I were a doctor, in Montana, you're going to have a myriad of emotions spiritually. morally, ethically, am I bound to this? And it seems to me that that oath is this large gray area where this is concerned, where I might have my own opinion as a doctor, but man, how do I apply that? Am I bound by law to apply it
Well, I think
according to the rule? Or
the doctor would have, maybe religious reasons or this Hippocratic oath that he's taken to take into account. And I think his right thing would be, well, I don't feel I could do that, but, Dr. whatever would be the right one for you to see. A referral.
Something I know is that, or I have learned, is that the Hippocratic Oath, in my mind, was always something doctors had to take. Like, it was your last step before graduation, and that all doctors agreed to it as like a moral standard or ethical code. And it's really not. It's kind of a ceremonial commitment in practice to this idea. And I've had doctors say to me, never done anything like that. And I've had some other doctors say, well, yeah, I subscribe to that, but my definition of suffering is different. And I think when you look at the debate about birth control, I have a doctor, I want to go get birth control from the doctor, and the doctor's like, no, I'm not going to prescribe that for you because we don't do that in this clinic. And then the question becomes, do I want him as a doctor because his values aren't in line with mine? Can I work around that? And again, that comes back to it's my choice to decide whether I want that doctor or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bigger question is when no doctor has the availability to give you what you feel like you are entitled to as a person.
right.
Like if it was illegal to get birth control at all. It's kind of,
Or if you were living in Zortman and you couldn't drive 300 miles to Billings or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I mean, and you are limited by your own mobility. And that, I mean, it would be easy if we all lived in a state where every town was as big as Missoula and as accessible. But I mean, that's I would see one of the biggest challenges if you're in Sydney, Zortman, all of these eastern Montana's towns, or even Troy and Libby and that sort, is getting to a doctor that might provide that or might not.
right.
And then when you're at that stage of your life, how do you reach those doctors? I mean, those are all questions that are wrapped up into this that are left, I would think, kind of hazy by what the current practice is.
Mhm.
And being a rural state, man, that's a little frightening.
We are so rural, yes. And I would speak to that. There are a lot of doctors that this would never come up. Orthopedic doctors,
Dermatologists.
all kinds of doctors.
That would be
It's just a
odd.
non-issue.
Podiatrist.
And there's no
My term.
effort to require any doctor to provide it. Every doctor can certainly elect not to provide whatever it is that you're asking for. But if a doctor is willing, then it ought to be accessible. In terms of the rural, that's another whole realm of end-of-life care and hospice and education and accessibility, that there are a lot of people suffering needlessly because they are in a small town. And they're not dying, they're just suffering because they don't have access to Hestia or hospice or a
hospital.
support network. So in terms of death and dying, and the baby boomers are now, we're burying our parents, and we are going to be the next generation doing the dying. And I think that the people that I've talked to are right, that society will drive this. So in terms, to answer the question, I think there's so much more public education to do about talking about dying, talking about the inevitable, talking about, we celebrate all of these other things in life, and then death is this, well, we're not going to talk about that because it's too difficult. And it's going to happen to all of us. Everything that is born dies. And the conversations leading up to that are as important as any planning or other event that you celebrate in life. And that's one of the things that I know now from going through with my mom, that it's unavoidable. It's going to happen to all of us. We might not get a terminal diagnosis. We might get hit by that proverbial bus, but in the process of aging and dying, public education and conversations with your family are so critically important. And there's so much free literature and free support that our work will never be done.
That's true.
How, trying to figure out how to say this. Let's say it's a marriage situation and one of them is passing. What rights does the spouse have on that?
In terms of if the other spouse is dying and the living spouse is opposed to them doing this, that's a whole family conversation. One of the stories, I'll tell a story that Dr. Kress tells. One of the patients that asked him for this medicine, for the prescription, didn't want her family to know. She was Catholic and she didn't want them to know. And he counseled her and said, this is going to be the last thing that you do, and I just don't know that it's really appropriate for you to do something that you would be ashamed for your family to know about. And he didn't talk her out of it, and he doesn't talk anybody into or out of it. Again, it's a process that you go through. And so the dying spouse wants aid in dying, and the not dying spouse doesn't want them to do that. That's a case by case. It's a completely individual set of circumstances that I don't have the answer to tell you, oh, what would happen. The married couple would need to talk more and talk with their doctor more and talk with their hospice people more to get in better alignment. That said, if the dying spouse was adamant about getting it, I don't think that the not dying spouse could prevent that without there being a lot of court orders and rigmarole. One of the other things that Dr. Kress tells his story, and this kind of addresses the do no harm question, that do no harm can sometimes mean helping someone end their suffering, not extending their life for another 5 or 6 or 7 days or weeks, perhaps. It's honoring the patient's wishes and honoring what their unique set of circumstances calls for. Does that help?
Do they actually end up having set up a parameters, I guess, in order to be allowed to take medications?
I mean,
The
do they
patient?
have like a 6-month diagnosis?
Yes.
that you-
Well, there's
you
nothing-
have
there's-
within 6 months.
That you have to have terminal illness, like we said. But are there particular illnesses that you can have? Do they list them out? I mean, that if you do not have one of these, then you are not a candidate for this medication. Do they have those set? And are they?
Oregon and Washington do, and Montana does not. We have the Baxter decision that a terminally ill patient has the right to body autonomy and decision making. There are diseases that are not terminal. So Dr. Kress, I can just speak to him personally because I can repeat anything that he has ever said in front of the Senate. He follows the Oregon guidelines. Mentally competent, of adult age, terminally ill, 6 months or less to live, and able to self-administer. And that last one, able to self-administer, is pretty key in that nobody does it to you or for you. You knowingly take medicine that will, I think it stops respiration.
It's a nurse question.
Phenobarbital or Seconal.
That was actually my question. Can you talk to that in terms of, and not from a morality standpoint, but there's been a lot in the news about the death penalty and suffering and that. Can you talk to that a little bit and what medicine Oregon uses or Brittany used versus what the national standard is for that?
Not with a lot of credibility because I'm not a doctor. I know that Seconal and phenobarbital, is that correct? Any doctors in the house? is it
I
Pinot?
believe that's correct.
Phenobarbital?
But at times, some of that medication's not available, so I think there's been adjustment.
Yeah, there have been other
Medications.
alternatives, and things have been substituted in when they are difficult to obtain.
Kind of raises a bigger ethical question of blocking the best practice known, what will work 100% best, and that becoming more difficult to use, and then having to go to the plan B, which is not as, but I know that I've heard that that's part of what has been questioned in lethal injection cases, is which medicine is used because of availability and cost, and the fact of its availability and like in the time frame required for the execution date, and then a different medicine was used and it went bad, and going back to local medication would have been available.
Well, to me, and I don't know how much of it is political or whatever, but I mean, there have been accusations of people suffering
Right.
and that, so.
I would also be curious, like that'd be a fascinating study of, I don't know how you do it because they can tell you how that went for them, but people who want to do aid in dying are in a place where they want to go versus people who are being put to death, who might have a conscience, have not done the natural work that we see people do at end of life with their end of life review and their that. I would be curious to see if inmates on death row who know when their date is, if they go through that same life review process in an echoing way of someone on hospice with a regular diagnosis or a, that would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I mean, I would bet that there are many more factors than just the medication, like how healthy is your body, what's your will to live, like what does that look like? That seems reasonable to me. But certainly I'm not an expert on what medicines were used. I know that this is an oral medication that's prescribed, and that was an injection. I don't know if they're different or not.
The other thing that I would speak to on that is that if you choose to take your own life via a gun, for example, or some other medication that you overdose on and you are unsuccessful, that is even more tragic, in my opinion, that someone is suffering, they know they're dying, and they do the proverbial, in Montana, it's called the one-way hunting trip, where somebody goes out and they don't come back. But then you've got that stigma, and that suicide was the cause of death, and that fear that would go into planning taking your own life. Dr. Krust says, you know, we prescribe medicines every day that taken inappropriately could cause somebody's death. And his whole part of his story is that this is a treatment option for the condition of dying. It's a known outcome versus a botched attempt. And again, the fear and suffering that goes into planning your own suicide versus planning a plan of care with your physician. I think they're just completely different. And there are just too many stories. We've got a champion who I just met this summer, and her husband shot himself, and she came home and found him, and he had coincidentally invited all three of their boys to come home on that very day. So he had the boys coming home, and he shot himself, and his wife found him, and the boys landed that day, and they were there for her. So he planned and did his own end. And how much gentler and better would it have been if he had been able to see the boys and take a prescription and go to bed that night and not wake up? And that's what Brittany did.
We had the case at St. Pat's 5 years ago where a guy shot himself at the hospital.
Oh my gosh.
Bad manners, because of not only the effect to the family, but to staff.
So
Bad manners.
I think of Robin Williams, because when the news first came that he was dead, and everyone assumed suicide, and then finally people said it was suicide, there was a quick ration of judgment that it was selfish, and it was, you know, all of the common things you hear about suicide. And then when it came out weeks later that he had a Parkinson's diagnosis, or whatever it was, there was some terminal, there's some condition he felt ill-prepared for push him. I don't, you know, again, don't know him, don't want to judge the situation, but rather learn that, or see that there was suddenly a softening in the culture of compassion and empathy for that. And that gives me some hope of being empathetic to any situation, and whether that's the choice he would made if it was available to him or not. I don't know. I would just be so curious to go back and have that conversation with him of what if that was available to you, and if you knew that, if you could orchestrate that in a different way, or I don't know. It's just a big question for me that every time I see him on anything now, that's what I go to is.
I was thinking of the social, communal response. We're always more compassionate with the situation we understand than the one that's more general.
Yeah, where we just live to imagine why.
Yeah.
Right.
But when it becomes Robin Williams or my neighbor, oh, there must have been reasons that she or he did that. Or that's so-and-so.
Wouldn't it be nice though if we just always assumed that everyone was doing what was right for them?
That's none of my business. That basically it's your call. Now, who am I to make those judgments for you? You know, whether I'm a legislature or a...
And it would feel better, I would think, if we just sort of let people do that and had an acceptance of it. Like, I would feel better.
So how are they trying to put this across as being different from the, what is it called, unconscious sedation? Where you just
Terminal sedation?
Yeah, just sedate them down to the point of where they are comfortable and they're out of pain and they're just kind of in limbo. They're not actually dead, and that still is providing them.
Well, that's a really great question. At Bozeman Deaconess, terminal sedation is a treatment that is available, and it's prescribed and it's performed. And it is exactly what you just said, that it's enough medication that will end a patient's life. It boggles my mind that that's okay. And the dual effect is what it's referred to in medical terms, that we're going to give you enough medicine to really make you comfortable, and it might actually end your life. So the medicine is given knowing that it could cause death, but the intention is to relieve suffering. There again, the autonomy and decision-making of the patient to go, give me the stuff that's going to end my suffering within minutes of giving the dose.
I guess I have
And
a
that
question
is-
about terminal sedation, though. Can't that also be a family decision or a physician decision? I mean, someone may not be able to say that themselves, right? I mean,
Exactly.
Can you though? I mean, I don't know.
in places where it's legal. I guess in places where it's commonly practiced. It's not illegal to do terminal sedation.
No, it's not, and that happens every day. That happens all the time, and that's under the kind of the nod and wink of, if you give this much, it leaves too much uncertainty and unintended consequence. And again, I just come back to, this is what the patient wants. They want to end their suffering and not live in the condition that they're living. And through the disease, the dying process that they're going to go through. Does that kind of answer your question?
Well, I'm just thinking, it's a legal point right now that the terminal sedation is
Available.
accepted and available, and
Practice.
no doctor is gonna get thrown under the bus for this or anything like that. So why would we want to go any further if we already have this option available, that we can go ahead and sedate you down to where you are gonna be out of pain, you're gonna be out of your seizures, you're gonna be out of, your heart just firing off and not being able to stop it at all, and we're gonna get it under control for you, and then if you happen to pass, just gone.
So I guess
Why do we have to have another option?
what I've heard, I can just speak to what I've heard patients relate to me, which has really made me sit back and think. But there was a gentleman here, and so this wasn't a patient, but when Dr. Kress spoke, and he talked about his plan if it wasn't available to him, which was very traumatic and kind of took us all back. But he said if my family even has to change one of my diapers, if anyone in my family has to see me soiled myself, that is not an acceptable last memory for me. And so that's what popped into my head for that. And I think then comes the bigger debate of a family saying, but we'd be willing to do that for you. And that's what we need and want to do to take care of you. And then that debate of, you know, whose needs does this death and what it looks like serve?
And I guess, you know, from experience, just listening to hospice nurses, when terminal sedation is used, it's when somebody is more than likely actively dying. They are physically, or it's perceived that they are physically uncomfortable, and they're doing that to give them comfort in that moment. And then the side effect is that it could shorten the amount of time that you're alive. So it's happening during a really physical piece of that dying process. It isn't, I know I have a terminal illness, and so I would like terminal sedation today, please. But it doesn't look like that. It's different. It's given to relieve a symptom or a perceived symptom of pain generally or agitation generally. And that's what terminal sedation is used for. I think that that's pretty
and
close.
Unfortunately, I mean, terminal sedation too, you know, that's still a very case-by-case basis. I'll tell you, about 25 years ago when I first did hospice nursing, I cared for a patient and his family who had a brain tumor. And this man had the brain tumor for about 1.5 years, and his family wanted to keep him home, and so he had our hospice there helping. That tumor in his head turned him into someone that they did not know. He was violent. He was in so much pain. He said it felt like the top of his head was coming off. And when he broke out of his trailer home, picked up the door and threw it, we put him in the hospital. And we put him on morphine. And he died in the hospital about 3 days later. Now, that man was comfortable. He didn't have any more pain. And that tumor, while we didn't do another MRI, was the cause of his death. You know, that's what terminal sedation is to me. People do end up dying, oftentimes, from what is their terminal illness. And they're just comfortable while that happens. You know, specifically acute situations like that.
So I guess my question is, I feel like in my mind I've had those two things being different in terminal sedation, what that means. Like, do you want to choose to be more sleepy but comfortable, or do you want to be awake and in pain? And you get to decide where you are on that scale. Versus, we're basically going to have to put you under anesthesia to manage some symptom. Like, I always thought those were two separate conversations. Are they kind of blurry?
Well, do you think,
or what
do you think anesthesia is anesthetic gas or just an IV medication?
Right, it probably
For
is
pain.
both, or maybe one or the other. I don't know. I'd never.
Yeah, 'cause they give
That's just me wondering out loud. But we can't do. We don't use. That's not typically something done at home. That's something
No,
done,
and that's the whole,
In
that's
a
the whole
hospital.
problem behind
right?
terminal sedation. It must be done in a hospital.
Right. Like morphine at home to
We
keep you
cannot
comfortable is
provide-
not.
Yeah, we cannot provide this in the home.
Even if a physician is doing it.
Correct. There's no way to monitor it because the propofol must be monitored continually.
Was that the Michael Jackson drug?
Yes.
I guess I didn't realize that terminal sedation was a certain medication that was used, because I would bet that there are other medications that would do it besides propofol.
There are.
Okay.
But isn't it that anesthesia piece of? Is it anesthesia or is it just? I don't know. I guess those are two different levels of consciousness in my mind, but that's just a.
I can't speak to that. We need a good anesthesiologist to come.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far in the
That would
weeds
be
on medicine,
good.
but I do want to say that aid in dying is such a small slice of the population, because palliative care and end-of-life care and hospice really do provide what most people need. To answer that question, your question again is why or why not is the choice. I don't want to go through the dying process. I want to die next week after I've had a celebration with my family, and I don't want to go through several more weeks of deteriorating and diminishing and have my family have to suffer through all of that with me. And okay, my family is willing to take care of me and change my diapers and help me through the dying process. Well, I don't want to go through it. I don't want to do that process. I want to go out on a high Seinfeld note, happy and aware, and avoid the suffering and putting my family through the suffering. And I'm saying that not facetiously, but anecdotally. It's the choice of the patient. I think I go back to Brittany Menard. She was having seizures and she didn't know when the next one would come or how long it would last, and she really didn't like being immobile and unable to talk. And she didn't want to end her life in that state. She didn't want to end her life having her family go through all of that with her. I think that there are, my mom is case in point. We had some really beautiful, divine, fabulous moments with her in the last few days. Had she been on hospice for 9 months, who knows what that would have looked like. I don't think that there's any answer or prescription or set of circumstances. Well, oh, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. It's individual based on your body, your family, your belief system, your doctor, all of that. And I think no one should tell anyone else what you should or shouldn't be able to do.
I have a spiritual question because I'm not Catholic and I don't know the answer, but is suicide considered to be a sin?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Mortal.
Morals.
Haven't they changed some of that, the Catholic thinking?
No.
I haven't seen anything.
Not since Vatican II, no.
Oh, okay.
Well, we haven't even talked about another an option. And I don't know if you're going to come and talk about VSED or not. Is that going to be a topic this
About what?
next year? About voluntary stopping of eating and drinking?
Oh yeah, that's funny. I was just going to ask the same question. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. Voluntarily stop eating and drinking, or VSED, is when a patient refuses food and hydration, knowing that that will end their life. And that's acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
There again, I'm like, so why isn't this other piece?
It's legally acceptable, although we have seen physicians that call that suicide, and they're really uncomfortable with it for their patients. I mean, I think that there still is that option of looking at it in many different ways, but it is not illegal. I mean, that's true.
But it also has to be executed. If you want to do VSED, then you really need to not eat or drink anything. And again, that is going to cause your death. The medical team is there to make that process as easy as possible. Knowing, I don't know, my mom wasn't hungry for the last month of her life.
Mm-hmm.
So that may have been part of what caused her death. Congestive heart failure is what her death certificate says. But she had chronic pain for 10 years and all the medicine that goes with that. She had MS for over 30 years and she had dementia, and she just dwindled. She dwindled down to, I don't know how many pounds she weighed when she died.
I just know that someone would have to terminally sedate me before I could go without food. Like, I have to be so done with living to not want another piece of cheesecake before I go. Like, that's just not how I picture that for me. I don't want to say that can't be how somebody else does it, but like that's so far-fetched for me. But thinking of someone else who would want to do it that I love, like not feeding them would feel so uncomfortable. Yet I have that conversation with people that try to feed people who don't want to eat. So it is so, I just want to acknowledge that even though I try to be objective, I still have stuff inside of me that goes, eek. It just, it's just different than what I'm used to. And I don't know which way I want to push me to think, because I'm not ready to commit. And luckily, I think that I don't have a death date sooner than later, that I'm going to have to start thinking about that.
You got a couple.
A couple weeks. Let me see here.
Have another piece of cheesecake.
72 days, you're good.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
I think it offers a really interesting question though, because it can be a slippery slope, especially if someone were to have dementia and they had let their wishes be known, and then their family members are saying they don't want to be fed now. And then what does that really look like? And do we really know that that was their decision? And then what if they ask for food? Then what do you do? Not give them food? I mean, my agreement with all my friends is to tell me I've already eaten. I want you to say that if I have dementia. You've already eaten today. I'll be like, okay, good. I'll probably be relieved. But I think that does offer up a really valid question.
Mm-hmm. I just will say again that I love what you just said, for me.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's the bottom line. It's you and you and you and you all have different belief systems. You all have different bodies. You all have different families. It's an individual, unique set of circumstances in every single case. And I'm sure that as a hospice nurse you can say you've seen good deaths and bad deaths and everything in between. And there's no script. There's no recipe for how do people die. We die in a wide variety of ways, but
There's vague laws, it feels like, that keeps you out of jail. Like, I know there's no easy script about it, but then there's that fear of, I want to be with my family forever and not, I want to carry someone's torch for and I want to honor what they want to do, but I also don't feel like I can go against the very vague law that could put me in, that's the part where I empathize with the physicians who do want it more black and white, because then it would be easy, because then they know
it's
that they
never
get
going to be
go
black
home.
and white. It will never be black and white because it's a human body.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting thing to say, because I know physicians that say, I might use physician aid in dying. I'm not opposed to it. I never want to prescribe it. Not ever. Don't put me in that position. And that I can see would go along with the Hippocratic Oath or your own personal views of, I don't want to ever be wrong. I don't want to make that decision for you. And so what would the other options be? Like not eating or,
But I want
a
the
one-way
doctors to
hunting
look at
trip.
it, yeah.
I mean, what else? What other things could you choose from then? And that's a really difficult thing to know.
Well, with your advocacy on this stuff too, is that how closely are you working with doctors in the state, like statewide, on whether you have an abundance of doctors that are willing to do this? Because the law's not necessarily any good if nobody's willing to apply it.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're open to having that choice wherever they're at, if they can just say, against my morals, not going to do it, just because I can. Do you have a feel for that? I mean, it seems like in some of the more populated places in Montana, it might not be an issue. Maybe.
Well, doctors are people too.
Oh, no.
And they're all unique and individual as well. There are certainly a whole collection of doctors that it's never going to come into their practice. Another whole collection of doctors that we already know are opposed. So as far as an abundance, I don't know. We don't have the statistics like Oregon does. We don't have a list. We don't have a list that, here you go. We don't want to put doctors on a list. Dr. Kress put himself on the list. But the individuality of the patient-doctor relationship, there may be a doctor who, like Dr. Kress, he was willing to prescribe it for some people, and other people through the counseling and the process and the dialogue, they themselves decided they didn't want the prescription. Doctors who deal with death as a part of their life, oncologists and other people that, other practices that are intimately involved with the end of life. I think that's shifting. I think that there is a new way of thinking with Brittany's story specifically, that doctors are more open to this than they were 25 years ago.
And can you give me an example or an idea of what makes you think that about this state specifically? Not about a nationwide push, but a rural, largely Christian state.
Mm-hmm.
What is there anything that makes you or compels you to say that about Montana?
Just meeting more doctors in my work. I met a doctor yesterday, he's retired, but he absolutely believes in death with dignity. And he wasn't the kind of doctor that would deal with death, but as a human being and a person, he absolutely said I would want the option, depending on what my diagnosis is, I definitely would want the option to get the prescription for death with dignity. I really can't answer that in terms of the numbers. We have the champions that we have are solid champions. We have, in a lot of my conversations, doctors are like, you just should have, just leave it alone. We're doing our work and we're providing people prescriptions, and let's just keep it under the radar as it's been for years and years and years.
Kind of like don't ask, don't tell.
Exactly.
I mean, it really feels like
It is. It
it
is.
parallels that, but there's no security in it
Until there's some legal protection in it. And that's where, as a provider, I feel vulnerable. Not a provider, like I can write it, but as an advocate, I want it because I want it as an option. I'm not saying I'm going to do it.
Court
But I
case is not enough.
want to know, but apparently a court case is not enough.
But I guess with that too is what I would say, don't ask, don't tell got brought in the 90s, and we weren't ready for it then, but it was the law. And it took 15 or 20 years for the rest of America to kind of catch up. And then all of a sudden it was a fairly courageous step for them to move forward. And I'm kind of curious, is that what you're facing in your fight too? Is, okay, we have this, but we don't have, at least we have a small group of people that's not completely comfortable with that, like yourself, wanting to move forward. But how much pressure do you apply politically, and how do you kind of test the climate to see if you're pushing too hard for diminished returns?
It's a good point. I just got an email yesterday or today that 54% of doctors in America believe in death with dignity, and I don't know who all was polled or what the poll population was, but we are continually asking in America and in specific states, what do you think about this? And when it's framed in our language, that it's a medical option for the terminally ill versus assisted suicide, I mean, people are in favor of a medical option for the terminally ill. People are opposed to assisted suicide. It's just, that is just phrasing. When you ask a polling question, I don't know how many of you have answered polls before, but different words cause different answers.
Just the word
And
terminal.
Well, and also, Amy, you know, believing in it is one thing. It's quite another to, are you willing to write this script?
Or are you willing to take it as a patient? I completely
wonder,
agree.
You know, when you hear that 50%, really, how many of those 50% would be willing to write that prescription?
Right, because I think a lot of physicians do sit on both sides of that fence. Sure, I think it's okay. No, I don't want to ever do it. I mean, I guess one of the questions I have about that, you know, if it's a hush-hush thing and they want it to be left alone, like, don't bother with this, we have a good thing going. If that's true, how would people find out about it? And how would they know who to go to? I mean, I just think that, unfortunately, isn't the best for the patient population, because then they can't figure out how to be advocates for people who need it or for themselves when they want that. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I was wondering if Robin Williams knew, or what, yeah.
Would he even have known who to go
Would he even
to?
have known?
And then would you be comfortable asking a lot of people to find out because of their reaction? You know, would I have to poll you and ask you and then sort of worry about what you would say in return? But that seems like a really scary place. It's probably scary to ask in the first place.
Well, it's scary to me to think that, too, that it could become maybe like backdoor abortions were.
Right.
And it won't be that you're getting the finest medical care, but that you're getting medications that may not work from people that are not qualified to evaluate you well anyway. And so that's the slippery area there for me when it's not all above board.
Right.
Well, not just above board, going back to people having to choose traumatic deaths as their only option. That when I feel iffy and then I hear people and I think of what that would do, that sways me back into that loop. I think one of the things for me with Brittany Maynard is when you say like, don't ask, don't tell, went like this for a long time and then all of a sudden went like that. I've wondered what the last 3 months, considering her life and her message, Like, I wonder when that will stop, and if it's gonna plateau again, or if it's enough, or if another person's gonna have to come forward, or is that enough of the story that's gonna change it, or not?
It's going to be ongoing, but Brittany really, she's opened up the conversation globally, not just nationally. And just this one article, Benjamin Corey, he was convinced before Brittany's story that he was opposed, and now he's for this choice.
So there was a written letter, it was from a woman who had dementia, who was in Canada, and said, had written that she had planned her death in such a way that her husband would know about it but not be an active participant in it, because she didn't want him to be liable for it. And she said, if you're reading this, that means it's happened. And it's a really powerful letter, but it makes me wonder, what do other countries do? Like, what's the rest of the world
That was my
think
next
of that?
question too. Is it a cultural thing? Because we do live in a culture that's very death phobic. Is that part of what makes it so salient? Are there other cultures that feel
death progressive compared to other countries?
Hmm.
Like, I think of Ireland. I cannot see, I would imagine being, well, Protestant and Catholic, I suppose, but, you know, that religious roots ground so many countries in their traditions and what they're at. I would just wonder, like, if you made a map of what this practice looked like, acceptable-wise, what the world map would look like.
And I don't have a knowledgeable enough background for that, but I do know that Holland has a bit of a reputation for being a little cavalier about it, like it's accepted. People go to Holland on death vacation, apparently.
I've seen a video of that. That's where it was.
But not Ireland, apparently.
Every time that Dworkin was actually in the news, and that for every time that he would actually assist in a death, and everybody, how they looked at him at each time that it was brought up, and he didn't really want it to be something that was, you know, strange to people. He wanted to kind of get it out there and make it more available and make more people know about, you know, this availability. And yet, everybody really went against him at that time because, like you said, we're very death phobic in our culture here. And until we actually ended up broadening our views to more of other countries and how they actually see death, and then how we have changed in our views of death by allowing hospice. I mean, that's one of the biggest things. Instead of dying in the hospital, you know, we get to choose to die at home now. We get to choose to die with our family instead of being hooked up to monitors and ventilators and everything else. I mean,
Was he like aid and die and give you a medicine for you to take for yourself, or did he euthanize people? Did he give the medicine?
he set it all up, and you had to be the one that pushed the button that
Okay.
would allow the drug.
So he didn't actually do it.
He did not do
No.
it.
It was
So
always a
wasn't-
switch, yeah.
Euthanasia.
So my mind,
Switch.
I had always thought of him as a euthanasia doctor. That he
Oh, I
was the
did
one that
too.
did it.
And see,
But that's the cultural
what-
difference of.
But that's why.
And
they,
that's what the media portrays.
Right.
This is what they're trying to portray to people is, you know, here's the death.
Well, the death panels. I mean, yeah, I think
Oh,
that
death
is
panels.
sort of prolific, that we are a little bit afraid of dying, just little. And although hospice is wonderful, and I 100% agree with it, and it's been around, you know, since the 80s for sure in Montana or in the United States, still 80% of the people want to die at home and only 20% do. So even though that is an option, you know, it isn't something that we all do. And I think that that's worth looking at. And I don't think that that responsibility lies with the provider at a hospital, you know, or relies on things like this to talk about it and become more comfortable with making those decisions. And not to say that we even know what that will look like when they come up for us. You know, I don't know what will happen if or when I get cancer, however I die, what I'll do. But I like that I can talk to people about it, and I've had that conversation hopefully with my family.
I want to have that conversation with the doctors again. Remember when they came and talked about, you know, here's your scenario. It's your personal. This is your personal medical history. Do you choose to be a full code or a DNR? And all the doctors are like, DNR, 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is your patient. What are you going to say to them? And they say it's their choice. You know, so that study I thought was so interesting because it really shows that same side of dying in the hospital or dying at home, you know, I think there's a huge burden on doctors. And I'm feeling fairly empathetic to them that
Right.
this is what they lay in bed at night and worry about all these things that we've said here when they think about everybody else, and then when they turn it and look at themselves. I just think their ante is upped so much because of what they have on the line too.
There's an article, How Doctors Die, and
The radio lab was.
The radio lab, yeah.
they're less willing to go through the suffering and the deteriorating.
But they've seen it. I mean, I think that that's experiential for sure, and they understand what that process looks like, and it's up to us to ask those questions then. What does this look like to you? What would you do if this were you? You
What
know,
if this
what
was
are the
your
symptoms
mother?
that I might be looking
I
at?
asked hospice team, you know, if this was your mother, what would you say? What would you want? What would you do?
Mm-hmm. And I liked that part of the radio lab where he said, you know, in medicine we're taught that you're given a hammer, you use it, and then that's their practice. I mean, it's hard to sort of look aside from that unless it's themselves, which is a personal decision, and that makes sense. I mean, that makes a ton of sense. They're just asking the right questions.
What role do the nurses play in this?
What role do the nurses play in hospice care or in?
Navigating.
You know, I'm even thinking like, you know, you're talking about people making the decision to die at home or die in the hospital, and I'm wondering if they think they get better care in the hospital, and oftentimes they don't, because the nurses can't get around it, you know, to everybody, that kind of thing. And, you know, dying at home, if the family is taking care of them, not everybody is a caregiver.
Right.
So there's just a lot of things to think about in that regard for me.
And
And
honoring
there-
that 20% of the people do want to die in the hospital. And that's totally okay. That's still 20% want that.
Yeah.
You know, and as long as you were educated and you knew what your choices were and that was your choice, I think, like, what a beautiful choice. Have
But
that one.
ironically, like, Medicare doesn't pay for you to go and die in the hospital anymore. Like, I remember people being like, just because you're dying doesn't mean you have a diagnosis to be in the hospital as an inpatient anymore. And we struggle with that sometimes too, that question of, is it a diagnosis or is it that you're in a terminal condition? And it has been interesting to me to hear some Medicare language that says, you know, to pass away in the hospital, it has to look like this to have it covered by Medicare. Because families will say, what do you mean they're stable, they're dying? Why can't they stay in the hospital to die? It's like, well, they're not getting a lot of active intervention from the nurse. You know, you're not meeting the criteria that says you need 24-hour skilled RN care, which I think is a great opportunity for us to say, who does know better how to care for you than your family, and what is the fear that you feel security in being in this structure as opposed to home, and starting to explore those things. But I have seen and experienced those discussions of, you know, we know they're going to pass away eventually, soon, later, but dying alone doesn't qualify you to be in the hospital anymore. I would love somebody to come and visit more about that. I would love someone from Medicare come and explain that to us. Can I call CMS for that?
And Toby, what you said, I think, that everybody isn't a caregiver, you know, that's really a wise thing to acknowledge. But somewhere along the line, we gave up the responsibility of caring for our loved ones. There haven't always been those big, white, clean hospitals with clean sheets every day. And so we gave that up, and we gave up a lot of other things when we became as dependent upon the medical community as we are. But it's really amazing how some people don't think they can be caregivers, and they really can with just a little support. Not everyone, but I think more can and more are willing than we realize.
Right.
It's truly amazing. You know, sometimes we go into houses and we go, this is gonna be a challenge for this family. You know, we're not sure that, you know, that they can do it, whether it's commitment or whether it's physical capability or willingness to learn, that kind of thing. You know, and by and large, you know, most often it turns out pretty darn good.
And sometimes too, I mean, and when we say caring too, some families' assets are not their availability to change their loved one when they need to be bathed or those things. It might be that they can afford to pay for them to go somewhere where they get 24-hour care. You know, even if it's not the hospital, there are some families that their culture is, I want to provide the best for my mom, which means I want her somewhere in white clean sheets, intended to in that way, because that's been our family culture to have her cared for in that way. So being a caregiver, I think, isn't always the hands-on care either. I think sometimes it's addressing that, they would say, you know, considering my spiritual or my emotional state needs to be honored wherever I'm cared for. Like, you have to care for that from the caregiver and the patients. And it is a big conversation to weigh all those things. But when you start to have it, families and people in particular are able to be led to what their beliefs are already. It's just a matter of giving them permission to or explore fears and seeing how whatever resources available to them can help them support whatever their end result or goal is, you know? It is a lot of factors.
It is a lot of factors. That's the bottom line, that it's a lot of circumstances and it's a moving equation. It's not like A plus B and C, this is what we'll do. And even with my mom, every day was like, okay, should we change this? Should we do that? There were different things that come up. And the bottom line, I think, is that it's a unique person. Unique body, unique disease, unique family, unique set of circumstances, unique belief system and value system. And that's where I feel that you can honor your own and let me honor mine. If the option of death with dignity or aid in dying is not something you would choose, please don't take away my right to choose it if it's appropriate for me. Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't want to apply this if somebody is not in the set of circumstances that they would even qualify. Oh, you're qualified, you should do it. No, you should do what's right for you and your family. My little harmonium.
That's great.
Other questions, comments, please?
I guess the thing that reminds me before we close about that caregiver thing is that my brother is the biggest wuss about anything that's blood or guts or even talk about a surgery. And he's just like, oh, I'm going to pass out. I can't do it. But now that he has children, when his children fall or they get hurt or they have diapers, or he can do that. He can do that. It doesn't even a thought. And when I say, like, how is it that you, like, when your son cracks his head open, you can navigate the blood, and he's like, don't talk about it. It's different. But when he did it, like, he could do that. Although my mom, who's an EMT, when my dad had, like, cut his thumb off with a chainsaw, and she went in to do stitches with him, and she sees that all the time, passed out, right? Because it was someone she loved. So you just don't know. You don't really know what you're capable of. You don't know what that will look like. And that's why you get to have support and people who can walk you through it, because maybe you can do so much more than you ever thought you could, and maybe you can't do what you thought you could do. And who knows what that will be. I think that it's just case by case and be open to it. Mm-hmm. I'll dress your wounds though, if you need. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Amy, for coming. Mm-hmm. I think that it's such a lovely discussion, and I'm glad that we get to hear from you often. So anytime, you're welcome. And thank all of you for coming too. If you have questions that you'd like to ask Amy one-on-one, she'll be here for a little bit. Mm-hmm. Yep. So that would be great as well. So
thank you all very much for coming, for your attention and your comments.